Yeah, here we go. So it is my pleasure once again to welcome you back for Cynthia Heidi's next segment of our seminar with the Nicodemus Society. We're looking forward to this. I want to invite you to do something very important though right now. Now, I would never advise you using no-dose. It's not good for you. It just lies to your body, right? Okay. But if you're like me, you may suffer from a problem called slow dose after lunch on Sabbath, okay? So why don't you just take a nice deep breath and oxygenate your brain cells with me. Let it out slowly. Oh, let's do that again. That felt good. All right, let's pray, and then we're going to let Cynthia have the time. Let's pray. Our loving Father, we are grateful that you have invested so much in us as individuals by creation and by redemption. And every resource that we use every day is really yours, and you give us the privilege of using it and the offer that you will multiply it as we join our lives with yours and live in union with you. We do want to live that way, and we know, Lord, what brings you the most glory is when the story of Jesus, the truth about your character, your love and salvation, comes to someone who doesn't understand or know that love. We want to be instruments like that in your hands that you can use to do a mighty work in this world. We confess in many ways we have fallen very short of your ideal for that. And we're looking for answers today, and we believe that you've raised up Cynthia and her team and others around the world to help us understand how to do that better. So please, Lord, multiply her ministry today under the power of the Holy Spirit, and may it multiply as we are touched by this message and begin to implement these principles of your kingdom in daily life. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you for sticking around, everyone. I am so glad we got some yummy food before continuing our conversation this afternoon. Be aware that this afternoon it's going to be much more interactive. So I'm going to be asking you questions. I don't know if everybody can hear each other or if there needs to be a microphone or something, but be aware that I will be asking you all questions. And we're going to do at least one poll for the audience. Oops. And, oh, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. So the first question I'm going to ask for you all is, have you ever gone on a mission trip? Yes. I'm sure many of you had. Shout out, where did you go? India. Ooh. Wow. You guys are really well traveled. Some very lovely, exotic locations. I think what I heard, most of them I've never been to, so that's very exciting. I'm sure you did amazing work with whoever you were partnering with. As I think about my experience and going on a mission trip, I actually went on a very unique mission trip that completely changed the course of my life, and this is actually where I went. So it does not look probably like the places that you all described, but this is actually a mission field, and this is Harvard Business School. Most people wouldn't picture, this type of institution as a mission field, but if you really think about it, the natives are predominantly atheist. They really do speak a different language, and God is rarely a topic of conversation. So I felt very convicted several years ago when I had the choice to go to business school. I felt very convicted that I didn't really need it for my career, actually, because I wasn't changing careers, but I felt convicted that God wanted me to go there to actually share the gospel. And so what I'm going to talk about today is why this matters. Like, why do we as a church need to be much more deliberate and effective about sharing the gospel with this group that I call the wealthy, the worldly, and the well-educated? So we're going to discuss a little bit about what those three W's actually mean. So let's start with the well-educated. You are probably one of the 35% of Americans. It's about 127 million people in our country that at least have a bachelor's degree. So we are, as an Adventist church, we pretty much over-index there. But sadly, what the research shows is that if you tend to be more well-educated, it's actually negatively correlated with belief in God. So that's why this is a tough segment at times. And I can tell you that I've lost track of the number of times someone has found out I'm a Christian, and they'll say something along the lines of, "Really, you're a Christian, but you're so logical." So we'll talk about that. Second W is the worldly, which I'm sure you're familiar with this mindset, but it's essentially a mindset that's focused on wealth and fame and power and influence, and it can be very distracting. I'm sure you are familiar with what that mindset looks like, and you probably have friends and neighbors or even family members that understand that too. So that's the worldly. And then let's talk about the wealthy. So first of all, wealth is a very relative term, right? Like in our world, just making over, call it $60,000 a year without kids will put you in the top 1% of the world in terms of wealth. So wealth is very relative. But when it comes to the US, there are about 337 million people. I was checking the numbers recently in the US, and we have about 1.2 million Adventists. So this segment in the top left corner in that gold box, it shows you the percentage of our population in the US households that are about 100,000 or more. So there's about 123 million people in this segment, which makes it a very large group of people. It's about the size of Japan. So it's larger than Germany, it's larger than the UK, it's larger than France. Now, if you do the math, and I pulled the numbers for North American Division's Adventist population, there is roughly 1.2 million people in North America Division. And if we look at the numbers, if you contrast the totals, the ratio is there's 330 non-Adventists for every one Adventist in this group. So we really under-index in terms of our representation there. So this is a really, really important group to reach that we need to really prioritize. And we're going to talk in a minute about why. Oops. And one of the best quotes for this is, I'm going to share it shortly, but before we go into that, I'd like to actually ask you the question, what do you think is challenging about sharing the gospel with this particular group? Like, just share, what do you think is tough about it? Okay, so say more. So it feels like they don't feel like they need God.
They don't have a need.
Okay, so there's not an obvious reason why they would want to know God. What else?
Busy.
Okay, that's a really good point. They've got a lot going on in terms of their careers, their lives, etc. So they don't seem like they have the time to pay attention to God.
I just want to say as well, it's that also a lot of these people, they got famous or wealthy because of the way they think, and the world embraces an atheist view of thinking. I mean, a lot of the famous people are atheists because the world demands it to be, or they can also be prideful and think, why do really God look at how I turned out?
That's very insightful. We're going to come back to that point, but it feels like they have a sense of arrogance that they don't really want anything else. Great point.
Just to piggyback off of what he said about being busy, I think it's also they just don't see a lot of other people, like religious people, because they are busy. They're in their own worlds. They don't get out a lot.
Yeah, it's a great point. They don't have a lot of exposure to people who are actually sharing the gospel with them. What else?
A lot of the wealthy are actually on the enemy's team. They are in secret societies, and they are involved in satanic cults.
Okay, so there's definitely some barriers potentially around how they're spending their time. What else?
On the other hand, there's a lot of people who are physicians and people in healthcare, people in medical research who are very humble and very giving of themselves, but I think they're very wound up in their work, and they don't have a lot of physical needs because they make plenty of money.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think we have one more hand over here. These are all really great. Oh, a few more hands. Lots of reasons why this is really tough.
They feel what they have is adequate and sufficient. They don't need for another God.
Yep. Really, really great point. I'm hearing that trend of not feeling a need for the gospel.
Yeah, I don't think they feel like the science supports creation and the age of the earth.
Yep, 100%. There are some questions about how can you help understand science in the context of belief in God. And one more here.
I would think, though, that there are some needs. We're My last hospital was in Boulder County, Colorado, which is the second wealthiest county in the state. It also has the highest teen suicide rate in the state. So there is a need, even if we can't see it.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So these are all fantastic answers, and we're going to actually just explore this idea a little bit more around what makes it challenging and how can we overcome that challenge. But I want to share a quote from Ellen White, because she actually wrote a lot about reaching this group with the gospel, and she said some things that are pretty hard-hitting. So she wrote, "We talk and write much," and by the way, someone helpfully suggested that it's really hard to see the references. I'm actually happy to share the slides afterwards, so you do not need to copy the quotes. "We talk and write much of the neglected poor. Should not some attention be given also to the neglected rich?" I think it's very fascinating. She used the word neglected rich. You don't often see those two words together. "Many look upon this class as hopeless. Thousands of wealthy men have gone to their graves unwarned because they have been judged by appearance and passed by as hopeless subjects." So she's not actually talking so much about like what's hard about them. She's actually pointing the finger at you and I and saying, hey, we're actually judging them as hopeless. But indifferent as they may appear, and this is what this gentleman over here was saying, I have been shown that most of this class are soul burdened. There are thousands of rich men who are starving for spiritual food. Many in official life feel their need of something which they have not. Now, I want to underscore this point because it often is easy to look at people who seem to have all these material possessions or influence or whatever, and it does look like they don't need anything. But even when I was in business school, there were classmates, I didn't realize this until I got to know people, but there were a lot of classmates who were struggling with anxiety and depression, and they were going to the school psychologist, and they were taking marijuana in order to manage a lot of their mental health challenges. And so as much as these people are incredibly accomplished and at the top of their professional games, they had a lot of needs and things that we probably don't appreciate by just seeing the surface level. And I think another interesting thing is I actually had a conversation during my time there with an atheist classmate who was completely intrigued by the concept of the Sabbath. Now, he's atheist, so he doesn't believe in God. But when I shared a little bit about why I keep the Sabbath and what's the blessing that I think it has in store for anybody, he actually thought it was so interesting that he was like, I don't believe in God, but I'd like to try keeping the Sabbath just because it makes a lot of sense. And he tried this, and he came back to me, and I asked him, like, hey, how's it going? He was like, honestly, I don't know how you do it, because I just don't think I can get everything I need done the other 6 days. And I was like, this is a great observation that you're making, and I know you don't believe in God, and I respect that. But I'm going to tell you that based on my experience, when you do believe in God, God makes you more productive the other 6 days. And so I was like sharing my experiences, but I thought that was hilarious that he even saw the logic of keeping the Sabbath from a mental health perspective. More recently, I think I mentioned I work at a leadership advisory firm. I was actually having a spiritual conversation with a partner that I work with you could call this person like a rainmaker at the firm. She's very, very successful professionally, brings in a lot of the biggest clients to the firm. And she's been going through a really, really tough divorce. And so when we talk about this class as soul burdened, I'm seeing this a lot with the people that I work with. So despite people, what they look like on the outside and how successful they seem to be, everybody has needs and things that they're hurting about. So, given that, what else did Ellen White talk about in terms of reaching this group? She actually wrote, men in business life in high positions of trust, men with large inventive faculties and scientific insight, men of genius, these should be the first to hear the call. To them, the invitation must be given. So this goes beyond, hey, let's reach this group. She actually says that we should have reached this group first with the gospel. And the question is why? She continued writing, converted to the truth, they will become agencies in the hand of God to communicate the light. They will have a special burden for other souls of this neglected class. Time and money will be consecrated to the work of the Lord, and new efficiency and power will be added to the church. So the reason why Ellen White wrote that we need to have prioritized this group with the gospel is because it's very simple. They have the money, the resources, the influence to accelerate the spread of the gospel. So to put this into perspective, who do you think is the number one billionaire in the world on the Forbes list? Does anybody know who's on the list, number one? It's Elon Musk. So he's obviously Tesla SpaceX CEO, and I pulled up his number recently. His net worth is $215 billion, which is kind of mind-boggling. It's very hard to wrap your head around that. And I just searched the latest number on the World Adventist tithe and offerings, and so the latest number I found was around 3.7 billion is our world budget. So if you put that into comparison, Elon Musk could fund the world church for nearly 60 years. Now, I'm not saying that our own personal giving and tithe and offering doesn't matter. It does. I'm just trying to help you understand why perhaps Ellen White was saying that if we had more people with the means and influence, it would accelerate the spread of the gospel.
Yeah, if he would just get converted, we'd almost double.
Imagine how much work we could be doing. Exactly. So let's think a bit more about what's stopping us from doing what Ellen White wrote, 100 plus years ago, on why we should have been working at sharing the gospel with this group and what makes it hard. We talked a little bit about what makes it hard, but let's talk about what makes it hard from our perspective. So I like to share this crazy image because it's a bit over the top, but just let it sink in and tell me, as you look at this crazy photo of this gentleman, do you think he would be interested in the gospel? And would you ask him for a Bible study? Right? Most people, and myself included, would look at this photo and say, there's no way he's interested. Right? There's no way I'd be comfortable asking him if he'd want to study the Bible. And the reality of it is when we have these thoughts in our minds, right, it's actually more of a reflection on how we feel, because the way I thought about it as I have reflected on what I feel when I reach out to my coworkers and my classmates over the years is the reason why I hesitated, or why we hesitate, is because we think that what we have or what he has is better than what we have. Right? Think about it. Because if we really believe in the power of the gospel and how it has the ability to completely change your life for the better, wouldn't we be happy to share and be much more comfortable and empowered to want to essentially share the gospel, even with someone who looks like they have it all? And Ellen White did not mince words, by the way, about this challenge. She said, there are intelligent men and women whom we are afraid to work for, fearing repulse. But earnest efforts should be made for the higher classes, coming close to their hearts, visiting them, and using special wisdom to win them to the truth. One reason why efforts have not heretofore been made for the higher classes, as I have presented before you, is a lack of faith and real courage in God. That's hard to hear, right? Because I wasted so many years of my educational and professional experience basically because I was afraid and because I didn't have a lot of faith and I didn't have real courage in God. And so it's very illuminating that, again, it's always funny how there's all these very insightful things that were written 100 plus years ago, and then if you look at the Bible thousands of years ago, and there's all these nuggets that are very hard-hitting that we need to reflect on them and really think about, what does this mean for how I live my life now? So I'm going to go through 3 steps for how can we actually be more effective at reaching the gospel, or sharing the gospel and reaching this group. So these are the 3 steps, and I should call this more like prerequisites, because it's very hard to share the gospel if you don't have these 3 things. So the first one is we have to experience heart conversion, because we can't share what we don't have. 2 is it's important for us to experience life transformation. If you were at the service this morning, we talked about how it's so important to bring our A game, right? To do our best and glorify God with everything that we have. And if we're doing that, it's going to change our lives, right? 3 is you have to establish authentic relationships. So we're going to talk about more about why that matters, but I've had some conversations over the last 24 hours with many of you, and I'm sure some of you have, friends, family members who are no longer believers. But when it comes to actually having the opportunity and the access to share the gospel, it's really, really important to have relationships first. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these. Let's talk about the first one. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'm going to ask the question to you all. How do we know if we're heart converted? You might want to say it one more time for the
What do
audience.
we think about and what do we spend our time on?
Okay, so there's a little bit of like, what are we focused on? How do we spend our time? 100%. What else?
Who we worship.
Ooh.
If we're worshiping the man in the picture there instead of God, he has no need of God because he is God.
Okay, very, very good answer. It's around like, what are you worshiping, and similar, where are you spending your time?
What and who is most important in our lives?
I love that. Yep, absolutely, great answer. Anybody else? Okay, so these are all, yes.
Who not only has your heart and its affections, but who has your will? Am I willing to follow?
Yes. Love that answer, especially given what we talked about on Friday night about being open to God's will. These are all fantastic answers. I'm going to share a couple of verses that I think boils it down to something very simple as a litmus test. Everything you shared was correct, but here's a very simple litmus test of how do we know we're heart converted or not. So the first verse is in John chapter 3, where it says, "You must be born again of the Spirit." And as a reminder, this is actually an exchange between Jesus and Nicodemus, when Jesus was telling Nicodemus about you have to be born again. And what's interesting in the book of Acts, it says the Spirit will make you a witness, right? So if we're heart converted, you're going to be a witness for God. So said differently is, if you're not a witness, then you're not heart converted. And I had to realize this during my spiritual experience, because for a long time, I honestly didn't want to be a witness. I was uncomfortable. I didn't actually want people to ask me about my faith. And that told you a lot about the condition of my own personal heart with God. And so bottom line here is your witness is a barometer of your salvation. And the reason why is because when you are heart converted, you see people very differently. You wonder, how can you show people God's love, right? Because there's a sense of urgency, right? You don't know how much time you have left, how much time the people around you have left. And so there's this sense of urgency on like, how can I proactively show them God's love? The way that I thought about this over the course of my life is just very simply by contrasting my undergraduate experience and my graduate school experience. So I went to undergrad for chemical engineering, and at the time I wasn't heart converted. And my focus during that time was very much on just being the best academically. You could say, I think somebody over here said about like, what do you worship? Is a barometer of how do you think about heart conversion. And at that time, I worshiped the God of academic success. And so I was incredibly hyper-focused on just being the best in school. And contrast that with my experience in business school, where that was post my heart conversion experience. And I wanted to be good enough in school just so I would have credibility per what we mentioned before. But I knew that my bigger purpose of being there was actually not to just be the best in class. It was to be able to share the gospel. So the contrast of my mentality and what I focused on and how I spent my time versus my business school experience was completely opposite. And the person I was in undergraduate experience, I was not focused on building friendships. I was not focused on helping people. Actually, really ashamed as I reflect back on some experiences where like people who didn't understand the concepts in class would come to me for tutoring help. And sometimes I would just be really impatient and I didn't want to help them because that wasn't helping me get to my academic success. So you can see the contrast of what happens when you're focused on helping others versus when you're focused on helping yourself. So let's go to the second step or prerequisite, which is experiencing life transformation. So this one is not that surprising, given everything we've talked about to this point. But let's say that someone gives you a recommendation to their favorite restaurant. What would increase the odds of you trying that restaurant? Okay, so if they're trustworthy, if they have good judgment on what good food tastes like. What else? We have a couple in the back.
If they went with you.
Oh, okay. I like that. So if they invited you and went with you, that's a great one.
If you know them well.
Okay, so if you think you trust them, you believe their perspective, you like their opinion, I like that. Anything else?
Anyone else?
Find denial.
First, I would read the reviews.
I love it. If they have a track record of giving great advice on restaurants. Brilliant. I love it. These are all great examples. So let's actually think about this, right? It comes down to credibility, right? You're essentially asking the question, is this person giving me this recommendation a credible source? Do they have maybe similar tastes to mine? How convenient would this be, right? So that is why life transformation is critically important, because the reality of it is that sin separates us from God, okay? And you can't share what you don't have. So it's very hard for us to be able to share the gospel with people if we actually, well, A, don't care about sharing the gospel, but B, if you actually don't have yourself as like a living example of why someone should care about knowing God. Right? And so it boils down to this, is that if you have the label of Christian on the back of your shirt and people know that you're a Christian, you have the ability to either make God look awesome or God look terrible. And so I want you to think about a person in this group, right? A wealthy, worldly, well-educated person, maybe they're super secular or whatever. I want you to picture this person. They could be a family member, they could be a client, they could be a classmate if you're in school. They could be a neighbor, right, or a patient. So picture this person in your mind, and I want you to ask yourself, does he or she admire you and want to be like you? Right? Because if the answer is yes, that's wonderful, because if they know you well and they know you're a Christian, that's a good sign, because they're basically saying, okay, I have actually this experience with a lot of people over the years. I've met a lot of atheists and a lot of people who don't have a lot of respect for religion. But if they get to know me and they respect me, they're at least going to say, okay, I don't believe in God, I don't want to believe in God, but I can at least respect people who do. Right? So this is very important to testify of who God really is. And there's lots of verses around this topic in the Bible. One of them is, whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. And then we talked about this one this morning. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. So I have many stories around this topic, but one in particular that I remember is I was at a corporate offsite when I was a strategy consultant. And I met this fellow consultant who literally has a PhD in astrophysics from, I think, Cornell, I think is where she went to school. So she's a very, very smart woman. She's ethnic Chinese, grew up in China, completely atheist, obviously, from a cultural perspective. And we kind of bonded because she found out I didn't drink alcohol and she didn't drink alcohol either. And she was intrigued by my lifestyle. And so I think over that weekend, I invited her to work out with me, and we had some meals together. And so after that, we were able to have some interesting spiritual conversations. Now, I'm going to ask you a question similar to what I had this morning, she is someone who is very ambitious. While we were both consultants, she was actually buying and investing in real estate the whole time. I forgot how many houses she had by the time she moved on to something else. But she's a very ambitious person. And I can tell you the reason why she was interested in talking to me is because A, she respected my lifestyle, and B, she knew about my, people kind of talk, so people knew about your professional ratings at work. And so I know this because she commented on it. She would say, oh, I heard you got rated XYZ. So that's really why it really matters to have credibility at work and bring your A game, not only professionally, but in your personal life, because that's what points others to who God is and what God has done in your life. And this is actually something similar that Ellen White has talked about significantly a lot. She said, in order to do this, meaning to share the gospel with this group, all the workers will have to keep themselves up to a high level of intelligence. They cannot do this work and sink down to a low common level, feeling that it does not much matter how they labor or what they say, since they are working for the poor and ignorant classes. They will have to sharpen up and be armed and equipped in order to present the truth intelligently and to reach the higher classes. Their minds must rise higher and show greater strength and clearness. That's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, she's not mincing words here. Like I said, you have to bring your A game. There's actually a very simple list of ways to bring your A game that is not actually rocket science, right? This is the 10 things that require 0 talent list. Being on time, having a positive attitude. You know, the funny thing, I think there's someone in the audience that I spoke to who is an executive coach. I also coach executives. Being coachable is actually a really important characteristic for great leaders, right? There's a lot of leaders that I assess at work who their upside potential is pretty limited because they won't take feedback. So think about that. Next time you're at work, you're in school, and someone actually gives you some tough feedback, do you actually listen, right? Do you actually internalize it? You know, putting effort, having energy levels, being prepared, right? There's so many things that don't actually require that much talent that you can do to bring your A game. So as we think about this question around, would that person that you pictured in your mind, do they admire you and want to be like you? Think about how you show up, not just in school or at work. How do you show up from a health perspective? Like we talked about Daniel this morning. How about the hobbies and interests you have? How you communicate? People notice around how authentic you are with your spiritual practice, right? Your temperament. Do you manage your temper and your attitude at work? So there's so many things that people notice that really are constantly under observation. There's actually a recent example with my workplace where I work with a lot of different consultants and different projects at work. One in particular, she also happens to be Chinese. She and I got to work on some projects together. She's a little bit less tenured, so I was kind of mentoring her along and coaching her up. And she told me the other day that no matter what project is available, she was like, if you asked me to do it, I would jump on it. And I was like, oh, thank you, that's so nice. And she actually was telling me a little bit about some of her challenges with imposter syndrome, which is very normal. You know, a lot of people have that. And the pressures that she has 2 young kids at home. She obviously has this, stressful job. And so she was telling me how she sometimes feels like she can't do everything well, and everything is kind of subpar. And so I was encouraging her and listening a little bit more about what she's experiencing. And I told her, all of us have a lot of challenges, and many times we all don't feel like we're bringing our A game to every aspect of our lives. But I told her something that really helps me is to maintain perspective. As I told her a little about my lifestyle regimen, how I try to pray every morning before I start my day, and about the Sabbath. And she got really intrigued about prayer because I didn't even know this until we had this conversation. Although she's grew up atheist with her parents, and she's, like I said, Chinese, she said she had a Catholic nanny growing up. And so she got a little bit of exposure to God and faith through that nanny. And so she was like, since then, I actually do believe God is real, and I try to pray, every once in a while in the evenings. And I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And I asked a little bit more questions around, like, what makes you continue to pray even now? What kind of impact do you see, and things like that. So we talked a little bit more. And I actually told her, that's why I value my prayer life so much, because when I start in the morning, I feel like it doesn't mean the day is going to go perfectly, but I do feel like it resets my mindset, and it helps me be prepared for potential challenges throughout the day, and it makes me more resilient. And so she was very intrigued by that, and we'll talk about this in a second, but I left her with an open-ended invitation to study the Bible in the future. And a couple of weeks later, we were both on a call about something around how do we coach our clients to manage their energy levels. And she messaged me via Teams off, in parallel. And she was like, by the way, after our conversation a couple weeks ago, I decided to try praying every morning, and it's been a game changer. So that's what she texted me, like literally a few weeks ago. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. I'd love to hear more. So I'll continue the story later. But this is why it's so important for us to think about how we bring our well, first of all, allow God to actually transform our lives so that we can be living examples to the people around us. So question is your life a credible reflection of the transformative power of God? So that takes us to our third prerequisite, which is establishing authentic relationships. So this is the question for you all. How do you know when someone genuinely cares about you as a friend or colleague? Okay, so they reach out and connect with you. What else?
This helps my slow dose.
So you're post, just don't get rid of those carbohydrates that you're in. I think if you're having troubles, then they reach out to you and ask what they can do to help.
Yeah, I love that. So they're there for you when you're having trouble. What else?
They care about you.
Yeah. Oh, here's a few more hands.
Their eyes light up when they see you.
Oh, okay, they're happy to see you. I love it.
Just, how are you doing? How was the evening?
Yeah, they check in. They check in and they see how you're actually doing. We have one more hand in the back.
They're willing to spend time with you.
Ooh, I love that one. Yes. So all of these are fantastic answers that tell you when someone genuinely cares. So Jesus actually role modeled this really well in terms of how he interacted with people and how people sincerely felt how much he truly loved them. And a great example of this is the story of Zacchaeus, where Jesus says to Zacchaeus, who many of you know his story, he's like one of the lowest people in society because he's a hated tax collector. And so Jesus says to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down from the tree he was in, for today I must stay at your house. Now, if you're familiar with that culture of the time, in that culture, you only invite yourself over to someone's house if they're like family. So by acknowledging him in public, right, this isn't a crowd of people, everyone hates the guy in the tree. And then Jesus basically tells everyone, this guy is like a family member to me, and I want to spend time with him. Think about how Zacchaeus must have felt being publicly affirmed in front of a crowd of people who hated him by someone who's very famous in that crowd, right? It's amazing how much that must have felt to Zacchaeus. There's actually some really helpful parallels that we can draw from this, which is a lot of times, I think someone I talked to the other day said that sometimes it's very hard to relate to people in this group if they're much more secular. They have interests that are wildly different than yours. It's sometimes very hard to relate. I can completely understand that because when I was in business school, there were a lot of activities that my classmates would want to go do that I had zero interest in, right? There was a lot of, bar hopping and like late night TV show marathons and all kinds of crazy things people were doing. And I knew that I didn't want to partake of those things, but I also wanted to build relationships. And so what I ended up doing is focusing on leveraging mutual interests, so things that we did have in common, and then trying to say yes to everything that I could. And if I couldn't say yes to something, then I had to respond with an invitation. So what that looked like is, somebody might say, like, hey, do you want to go to this bar? And I'd be like, no, I can't because I don't actually drink. But how about you come over with some other people for like brunch at my apartment on Sunday? Right? So pretty soon people realized, okay, she doesn't drink, she doesn't go to these things that we typically do, but she does like food. And so I actually organized like an international cooking class, you could say, where I had classmates from all over the world. So we would have like a 3-course meal, everybody would pitch in for groceries, and then someone would teach how to make these 3 dishes collectively as part of the group. And then we would eat it. It was delicious. So pretty soon people realized, okay, she doesn't like these things, but she does and loves hosting and doing all these other things. And so I started to say yes to things because people started realizing what I was interested in. So people would invite me to go rock climbing, or I'd invite people to go hiking, or one time some people asked me to go on a half marathon, or I should say to run a half marathon, which I said yes to follow my policy, and I still deeply regret that experience. I don't recommend. Maybe some of you are runners, but I don't recommend it. So that's what I'm saying by leverage mutual interests, right? If you can't say yes to an invitation, don't just say no. extend an invitation in return. There's a really great passage on how Jesus was so good at this. Ellen White wrote, while he ministered to the poor, Jesus studied also to find ways of reaching the rich. He sought the acquaintance of the wealthy and cultured Pharisee, the Jewish nobleman, and the Roman ruler. He accepted their invitations, attended their feasts, made himself familiar with their interests and occupations that he might gain access to their hearts and reveal to them the imperishable riches. So Jesus is an incredible role model for how to do this, right? Because he was so versatile, he could interact with people from all walks of life. But when it came to this particular group, it says he studied ways to reach them, to build relationships. He actually spent time with them. He got himself familiar with what they cared about, and he was able to build those relationships. And there's actually an interesting experience I had in business school where one of my classmates, she's at the time, she's atheist, and she's actually Jewish by culture, but she wasn't a practicing Jew like my coworker that I talked about this morning. She was just kind of like her parents were Jewish, but she wasn't practicing at all. She didn't really believe in God. But essentially, I got to know her a little bit. And by the way, speaking about our A game, the only reason why she came up and wanted to talk to me is because she told me she noticed my comments in school. Because if you're familiar with the case method that they use at Harvard and other schools, is you're essentially graded on the frequency and quality of your comments in class. So there's literally a person called a scribe in the back of the room, and all this person does is write down what everybody says. And then afterwards, the professor reviews like your scripts of what everybody said and who said what, and then you get graded on frequency and quality of your comments. So it's kind of a little bit intimidating. But essentially, this classmate, she came up to me and chatted with me because she noticed, I guess, the quality of what I was saying in class, and that's why she wanted to talk to me, and she had some questions. Ended up having a whole conversation with her about the Sabbath, and long story short, like fast forward the story, we graduated, and she reaches out several months later, and this woman is one of the most ambitious people I've ever met. She was really committed to working in the healthcare venture capital space, and so she actually got a job she wanted. But then months later, she reaches out to me and she's like, Cynthia, I think I made a mistake professionally. I really don't like what I'm doing. I have no idea what to switch to now, and it's really stressing me out, and blah, blah, blah. And so I ended up having a conversation with her about her career options, and I mentioned, you know what? I know you don't believe in God, and I respect that, but I really care about what you're going through, and I just want you to know that I'll be praying for you. And this is an email. I'm going to share with you an excerpt from an email she sent to me after that conversation. And she wrote, I wanted to tell you how moved I feel by the clear love in your heart. Even though I have not found faith, it means a lot to me that you're praying for me. So this is just one example of how we can have simple exchanges with people around us, and even if they don't know God, even if they don't want to know God at the time, we can be planting spiritual seeds and helping share God's love. And like I said, we'll talk about this more in a second, but even if you're just showing an atheist that a Christian person is kind, is credible, that they can respect that person, that's already helping someone become more open to the Holy Spirit. So this is kind of how I mentally think about this idea, is the first box on the left is table stakes, right? Having your A game, being credible, bringing excellence to the way you do things and allowing God to transform your life, that just makes people take you seriously. But if you can practice what Ellen White calls disinterested benevolence, right? And that term is very simple. It just means you have no agenda. It's like you're being kind and being loving with no agenda in mind. If you demonstrate that to a person, that takes you to the next level with the relationships, which is having magnetic love. And that is what introduces people to God's character. So what I'd love to do next is, we've been talking a lot about the prerequisites, right? Because we have to be heart converted, we have to experience life transformation, we have to have authentic relationships. And once we do that, we can actually be practical and tactical about sharing the gospel and having natural spiritual conversations. So before we do that, I actually want to take a quick poll. And I'm going to use a website for this. So let me just pull this up real quick. So if you can pull out your cell phones and go to this website called menti.com. And we use this code. Oops. I'm actually going to put the poll up at the same time. So you're going to see a question, which is, please indicate how much you agree with the following statements with respect to sharing the gospel with a W3 friend, family member, or colleague. So if you can answer the question, I am going to share the results. Here we go. And this is more for me just to understand a little bit more about where people are coming from. But here is the results so far. So it looks like there's a few people who are a little bit uncomfortable. Some people haven't really had a lot of experience. Some people have actually tried, but it didn't go well. And then a very small subset have actually had Bible studies. So this is tough, right? For all the reasons we just talked about in the beginning, it's not easy to naturally share the gospel with this group, but there's a lot that we can be very practical and tactical about to be, I would say, less passive and more proactive. So thank you for sharing that. It helps me a little bit to understand where people are coming from. But it looks like there's a good mix of people who've actually had some experience trying to share the gospel or even have Bible studies. So, all right, let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so the way I think about my personal experiences on my journey to learning how to share the gospel more effectively is there's 3 common archetypes of what I would call W3 Christians. And I'm speaking about this from experience because I have been one of these 3 archetypes at various points in my life. So the first one is the lurker. So this is the Christian who is very passive. He or she does not do really anything to share their faith and often hopes no one asks. This person is essentially just killing time until the second coming. So the second archetype is the wallflower. So for those of you who know who a wallflower is, like this is the person who gets all dressed up, looks fantastic, goes to a party, and then sits on the sidelines and just hopes someone will invite her to do something. And what this looks like from a perspective of a Christian is, maybe we are plant-based or vegetarian, we are healthy, we keep the Sabbath, we don't curse, we have all these wonderful aspects of our lifestyles, and then we're hoping someone will notice and ask us about our lifestyle, which sometimes works. Like I've had people do that, I'm sure many of you have as well, but it's a very passive approach, partly because, at least in the spheres of influence that I operate in, people don't always feel comfortable just like hitting you with, oh, why do you do this, unless they know you better. But 2 is, these are actually people that are pretty healthy themselves because they have very high standards. They want to enjoy their lifestyle and their wealth. So they're maybe not going to be that surprised by your plant-based diet because maybe they're plant-based themselves. So this can sometimes work, but it's not always effective. And people are generally conditioned to respect your decisions without questioning them. So then the third archetype is the outsourcer. So this is the person who, anytime someone, maybe someone is has a question about the Bible, the outsourcer says, oh, great question. Let me refer you to Pastor Mike. Or let me introduce you to my Bible worker. Or let me send you the 10-part prophecy seminar series that my church gave last year. And the reality of it is what's the likelihood that a person in the wealthy, well-educated bucket is actually going to want to talk to a pastor or a Bible worker or even watch the 10-part prophecy seminar? It's very low, right? And I'm ashamed to say this, but I had a coworker when I was in private equity who actually had some legitimate questions about faith, and I was a complete chicken, and rather than proactively helping him understand the question, I basically outsourced it. And this person never read or watched any of the material I sent him, and so it was a huge lost opportunity. And so the outsourcer rarely works, not because we don't have great literature or we don't have great pastors or whatever. It's because it's much easier for when we have the relationship and we speak their language and we have their trust, it's much easier for us to manage the potential questions or the red flags, and they're much more likely to feel comfortable talking to us, is the simple answer. And there's also the fact that people can sense if you're uncomfortable and you are not actually that sure about what you believe. And at this time in my life, I can honestly say I wasn't that sure about what I believed. And so I'm sure I lost credibility with this person simply because I didn't feel comfortable sharing the gospel. So if those are terrible ways of sharing the gospel, or they're not that effective, let's talk about what is effective. So I often use this analogy. Does anybody know what this is? Yes. So I'm not a fisher person, but I did talk to some fly fisher people. And apparently the way this works is when you watch people who are fly fishing, they're constantly casting, right? They're constantly throwing their bait in the water, and they're predicting where is the fish going to be. And so that's what this is the best analogy for how you actually attract spiritual interest. We are fly fishermen or fly fisher women. It's not this. This is commercial fishing, where you throw this giant net into the water and you drive the boat and you just drag everything in the water into the boat. And if there's something that's still alive, you just club it until it stops moving. That's not what we do when we're trying to share the gospel. So we're actually going to focus on how to reach hungry fish, because we're not interested in just anything in the ocean. We're looking for the hungry fish that are going to basically go after our bait. And the way to do this is, I call it the conversational menu of options, where you have a spiritual conversation, not because somebody necessarily asked you about something spiritual, but when someone asks you a very basic question, you offer them 2 or 3 responses, one of which at least has a spiritual component. So my favorite example for this is just a hilarious story. That when I was in business school, about to graduate, one of my classmates and I were catching up in the cafeteria. Or maybe it was a cafe, I can't really remember. But he essentially was like, Cynthia, a few of us meaning in our section, were talking, and we noticed something. And by the way, when I say we noticed something, I remember we talked about how people are always observing what you do and how you behave. He says a bunch of us were making some observations about the people in class, and we noticed that you don't wear a ton of makeup in class. And I wanted to know why that is, because he knows I'm a Christian. So he was like, is it against your religion to look attractive? And I thought that was so funny. I was kind of taken aback at the time. But this is what I did to capitalize on the opportunity and use the spiritual menu, a conversational menu of options, a few of which are spiritual. So this is actually what I said. I gave him 3 things. I said, first of all, I try to live a healthy lifestyle so that my skin doesn't need a lot of makeup. 2, I prefer saving my time in the morning for other things, like working out. I have some spiritual time in the morning. And then 3, I really only wear makeup when I'm trying to look older, more professional, or for special occasions like church on Saturday. So if you'll notice, there were a couple of spiritual, you could call it bait in the water, that I put. One was spiritual time in the mornings, and the other was church on Saturday. Now, if he was not spiritually hungry, he could have said, when you say you try to live a healthy lifestyle, or you work out in the morning, what workout do you do? He could have asked me that. But in this particular case, he was like, church on Saturday, what church do you go to? Okay, and then we ended up having an interesting spiritual conversation, which we'll talk about in more detail. But the point is do you see how you're just answering someone's question? They asked you a very basic question. It could be anything. It could be, what did you do last weekend? It could be, how did you spend your vacation? Or I've gotten the question, how do you balance, work and life and maintaining and not going crazy with all the stress? Whatever questions you get from people, the trick is to have very normal, honest responses, but try to have at least one of those responses have a spiritual component. And if you do that, it's very non-threatening because you're just answering their question. But B is if someone is spiritually interested, they might pick that particular response, and like my friend did that day. So how do you actually have things to talk about? Well, it's very important to have spiritual experiences regularly, right? For you to be able to interject spiritual answers into your conversations, you actually have to have something to reference. So whether that's your personal devotional life and things you're reading, or something interesting you observed, or going to church events like this one, or actually having a Bible study, or going on mission trips like what you talked about. One of my friends that I've been talking to about this, she actually was able to have a very interesting spiritual conversation with someone because she went on a mission trip. And her colleagues at work, where she doesn't work for a Christian organization, her colleagues asked her, where did you go? And she was actually on a mission trip, so she was able to have a little bit of a spiritual conversation there. How do you spend your time from a media perspective, right? So if you're having those spiritual experiences regularly, you will have the ammunition to actually use in those spiritual conversations. So, like I mentioned, any conversation can be turned into a spiritual conversation by just including at least one spiritual response. And we're going to practice this because I'm going to have you shortly get into a group, into smaller groups, and I'm going to give you some real scenarios that I've experienced. I'm going to have you practice doing this for real in a minute. But all of these questions that I've received are real questions that I have had spiritual conversations as a result. Here's some homework for you, by the way. On Monday, guaranteed, somebody's going to ask you, how was your weekend? So my challenge for you is to think about, what are you going to say? What are the maybe 2 or 3 things you're going to say that you can respond with, one of which has a spiritual component? So, for example, if someone asks me, what did I do over the weekend? I can honestly say, well, I went on a trip to Kansas. I enjoyed meeting some wonderful people. I shared a little bit about my personal experiences with the local community here on why I believe in God, or how to bring your authentic self to work, either of those. And maybe I visited XYZ person. Right? So those are like 3 responses, and if we're just testing for spiritual interest. So if someone is potentially spiritually interested, they might ask, oh, interesting, why do you believe in God? Right? So this is just a quick example of helping you prepare for likely conversations that you'll probably have next week. But after you have a little bit of an exchange, this is very, very, very important. Don't just leave it there, right? You just had a good little exchange. Maybe you shared a little bit about why you believe in God or whatever. But the key thing to end with is, if you'd ever like to discuss these topics further, just let me know. Why is this important? Is because after you have this exchange, maybe you shared a little bit about, something spiritual. If it was a positive exchange, people sounded interested, you want to actually keep the door open. Now, you shouldn't say, hey, we just had a great exchange. Would you like to study the Bible with me? No, because chances are they're not ready, right? They're probably going to just say no. But if you leave an open-ended invitation, you never know when they're going to say yes. And I've had so many examples of where people took me up on the offer months later. So after you have this exchange where, maybe you answered their question, they asked you a few more questions, always end the conversation, hey, I love this stuff. It's really changed my life. I'm happy to share more. Just let me know. Okay? So what I'd love to do is actually practice this. So I'm going to ask you in a minute to put yourself into groups of 3 or 4. One of you, and we're going to have a few rounds of this to practice, one of you is going to be the witness, one of you is going to be the prospect, and the other one or two people in the group are going to be invisible observers, okay? And if you're the prospect, I don't want you to be mean to the witness, okay? I ran this exercise a few weeks ago, and one of the fake prospects was like, "Aren't you a cult?" I was like, you don't need to be mean, because remember, we're establishing genuine relationships before we have this conversation, usually. So assume that you're a friend of the witness and that you respect and like him or her. So that's my requirement, because all of you are going to be prospects at some point. And then invisible observers, I just want you to observe the conversation and be prepared to share afterwards what went well, what could have been better. Okay? So that's what we're going to do in a minute. Before we do that, I'm going to share some tips for the witness, because all of you are going to be witnesses at some point. So here are some tips. First is be curious and ask open-ended questions to make sure you understand where this person's coming from. Because it's very, very tempting to assume you know exactly what they're thinking, and chances are you don't. So if they say something like, they made a statement like, "Oh, I actually grew up Catholic and I left the church, because I didn't like it." Don't just assume you know why. Ask them to tell you more. Like, "Oh, that's interesting. What happened? What turned you off about that experience?" Right? So like ask open-ended questions. And by open-ended, by the way, that means using what and how questions. So don't try to avoid using the why question, because why can be a little bit judgmental. So I encourage you to say, "Oh, that's interesting. What's behind that?" Or "How do you think about that?" It's much more less judgmental, and it's much more just open-ended. Second is to be humble, okay? It's very easy for us, especially if we know a lot about the Bible, to come across like we know tons of information. It's very important for the sake of the future relationship, especially if you end up studying the Bible together, is to approach this from the perspective of, hey, I'm still learning, I'm still part of, I'm still on my spiritual journey of getting to know God. I don't know all the answers, but at the minimum, I can at least share with you what I've seen and what I found compelling in case it's helpful to you. So that's number 2. Number 3 is, this is so important, make sure you frame concepts, like spiritual concepts and value, in secular terms. So if somebody asks you about the Sabbath, right? Think about how you would articulate what's the value to you about the Sabbath, right? So, you can be very thoughtful about your word choice. For me, I often say, hey, I just think there's something so valuable for mental health and for my ability to balance what I have going on in my life by having a dedicated 24-hour period every week where I can just focus on my faith, my relationships, and helping other people. So a very simple explanation. There's nothing hard to understand about that. So really think about how to express that. By the way, this is not exactly in the same vein, but I remember a friend of mine back in Atlanta who somebody asked him about, can you go do something with me on Saturday morning? This is a golden opportunity. Anytime someone asks you, you can share something, even if it's a few reasons. And my friend, rather than using that golden opportunity, he said, "I'm sorry, dude. I can't because I have to unlock the church in the morning." Now think about that. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of his friend. If I were his friend, I would be thinking, can't you just get someone else to unlock the church in the morning? And he didn't say it I have this incredible opportunity to spend time with my fellow community and worship God together. He was like, "I'm sorry, I just have to go. I have to unlock the church in the morning." He wasn't happy about it, right? So always think about it from the perspective of the person who's listening to you, of how would this sound to them? Is this actually appealing? Do you actually expressing something valuable to them that explains why you're committed to something? So fourth is whet the person's appetite, leave them hungry for more. So it's very tempting, and you're going to experience this when I have you in groups practicing this. It can be very tempting to hit them over the head with all 29, I can't remember how many fundamental beliefs we have right now, but hit them over the head with all of the fundamental beliefs at once. But that's not helpful. We're not trying to prove all of the amazing things that we believe are true. It's the goal is just to get to the next conversation. So the goal is really just to whet the person's appetite. There's many times where I've had like a hallway type conversation where someone asks me a question and I like give them a little bit and then I say, you know what, I can't really do justice in 5 minutes, but if you ever want to talk about this more, I'm happy to share. Why don't we just grab more time? Right? So the goal again is not to like hit them over the head. The goal is to give them just a few nuggets of why this is valuable, why this is important, how this has changed your life, and say, hey, if you ever want to know more, just let me know. Because if you do that, A, you'll be more prepared, and B, there's a legitimate reason for why you're going to have like structured time to really study something together. And then the last one is, I already told you this, right? Don't forget to leave that open-ended invitation so that you're leaving the door for more. I mentioned this morning the example of my Orthodox Jewish coworker. He accepted my offer like 9 months later. Right? The makeup conversation with my classmate who asked me why I don't wear a ton of makeup in class, he also accepted my invitation 9 months later. After we were like different countries even. He went off to work in India after business school, and I got a random text message from him 9 months later saying, hey, I'd love to take you up on your offer. And at this point I was like, what offer? Because I had also offered to help him like make lifestyle improvements. And so I was like, which offer are you talking about? He's like, I'd like to study the Bible. And this is like no communication for 9 months after our makeup conversation. So you never know when people, right? Because after you have that open-ended invitation, you pray for that person. You continue. I didn't do a great job of this because he was in India, but you should continue to invest in that relationship, follow up with people, ask them how they're doing, continue demonstrating that disinterested benevolence, and ask for the Holy Spirit to continue working on their hearts. So those are some tips. What I'd love to do now is give you the first scenario. So I'm going to ask you to right now go ahead and get into groups of 3 or 4. So look around, get into groups of 3 or 4, and then I'll talk you through the first example. And I'm going to need to have one witness, one prospect, and 1 or 2 observers. So go ahead and get into groups, and then I'll talk you through the scenario. Yes. You already have a relationship. Yep, assume you already have a relationship. It doesn't have to be super deep, but at least they like you and respect you. Okay, did everybody find your group? Okay, so I'll explain the scenario. So whoever's going to be the witness, here's the situation. You went to film a Hope Channel segment that had to do with your personal testimony and authentically sharing faith at work. Now, I encourage you, here's the tip, do not talk about like the Hope Channel, like try to keep it, remember, try to understand from someone's secular perspective what they would actually care to know. So that's what actually happened. You can decide how to frame that experience, but that's what you did over the past few days. And then the prospect, you're completely secular, you're not religious, you're actually atheist, and you think that Christian faith and meditation serve the same purpose. Okay? So that's kind of, and feel free to be a little bit ad-libby here, like I'm just giving you some very basic constraints and guidelines, but feel free to like ad-lib. But those are the constraints. So I'm encouraging you to like pretend to have a conversation and then we'll debrief on how it goes. Okay? So go ahead.
Even when they ask me a question about me, I try to turn it around to them. There's a consummate actor. Well, whatever. It doesn't matter. You need to talk about them because they will talk about you. It's because they're subject matter experts. How you doing Documentary that's going to be on TV.
What else did you?
I'm going to visit with you. Okay. I'm going to be quiet. See what you get to do. It would be fun.
So did you go to the? No. No, I'm in Costco, so I'm asking somebody about it. Okay, so ask. How are you? Good, how are you? Good, what'd you do? You know, I'd like to see this too.
And you know what? Some of those people that we prayed for actually joined the church and got
I should. It's more personal. Thanks a lot, Sally. You're supposed to be nice. You actually had someone say that to you? No, I actually do. Oh, I have to fight against them. Okay. The mental part, yes, all the time.
No, it's not yoga, it's transcendental.
What's one of your
That's what happened to the guy who went to the dentist and he didn't want any.
As a Christian, I believe because I tell you the truth, and I want to get to know him better. Prayer and I'm fine. Myself. Well, if you ever want to talk more about my experience, no. Why was it way too much?
Way too deep.
How's that deep?
They may not be interested in any Christian things and Christians.
How much you guys answer?
Right. So what did I say before?
Oh, people want to talk about this.
So when you ask...
Yeah, but she asked me questions.
And you can kind of answer. See, that's the thing. You kind of answer. And then if you had more time, maybe we could spend more time to talk more. And then it's up to them if they want to come. But then you turn around and ask
how would you
her.
kind of thing is they didn't even there was a kind of answer.
Or did I watch a film?
You went to, it says went to film. Oh, you went to film yourself.
Film of her or a film.
Oh, I totally took it out of time. That's all right. You went to a film.
So Sally, that's what she thinks. Sally, how was
I know someone who used to go. I know someone who used to go. So the dog was who you like saying it was used to doing that.
It was inspiring. What about the weekend?
Let's bring this back, everyone. So how did it go? I'm actually really curious to hear like observations. So this could be anybody, but especially the observers, since you got a chance to observe, as a neutral, invisible party. What did you notice? What was tough about it? What went well? What did you think were really good ways of having the conversation? What could have been better? So any observations? Over here.
Let's get the microphone. Yes. Sorry. Swodo's after me again.
Okay, I was the observer, and Dennis was the prospect, and Jay played the witness. And it was like Dennis was like a natural-born actor. He really acted like the atheist. And I was firmly convinced, like, oh, you've been an imposter in church all these years.
You haven't been around many atheists in your life, have you?
And Jay actually, right at first, was a little bit awkward, but he kind of got into character, and by the end, it was like he was authentic. So it went very well between the two of them.
I love it. What was hard about it? So Jay, since you were the witness, what are some of the tough things that you noticed about the conversation?
Well, it was kind of hard to just boot into it.
Yeah.
I mean, in the first place, it was abrupt. It was. But the challenge is, and Dennis presented this as somebody who had had a bad experience and a bad history with religion, and so the challenge was to be sure it wasn't about religion, and yet to try to angle that in sort of without, and make it more about success and make it more about peace of mind, and yet not be just about peace of mind, but about something that surpassed, just routine peace of mind.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because I'm going to tell you what actually happened, but that was actually the issue. Is like someone's like, okay, I get it. You're having peace of mind. That's wonderful. But like, how's that any different from practicing meditation? So that's really good.
That was the challenge.
Yeah, it was.
I think eventually I did manage to kind of steer it into that. It took a couple of tries.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to leave with an open-ended invitation?
No, you cut us off, right?
All right, no worries. Yeah, ran out of time.
We would love to hear at some point some of your questions that delve into the transcendent, how you lead into that. Surely you've got quite a bit of experience of that by now.
Oh, in terms of like how to get into this conversation?
Yeah.
Honestly, it's usually them asking you a question, right? Okay. In this case, I was catching up with her, and she's like, oh, how did your weekend go? I think it was like a weekend question, because I spent the weekend over at the Hope Channel. So I was like, oh, I was in Maryland. And she was like, what? You're so cool, because she's in D.C. Like, why didn't you come see me? I was like, oh, it was a super fast trip. I was just there very briefly to like blah, blah, blah. So I'll tell you what happened, but it's literally them asking you a question.
Cool.
Yeah. What else? Any observations over here? What worked well? What was tough?
I was the observer, Arla was the witness, Juliet was the prospect. Knowing both of them and their current lives, I know they always do this with their clients and patients. But Arla actually did an excellent job in just explaining what she was experiencing. Well, Juliet delved in very well into questions a little bit more. What that was all about, what normally a secular-minded person would. Yeah, for me as an observer, after listening to both of them, I want to watch Hope Channel.
There is a challenge in doing reply in non-churchy.
Mm-hmm.
It's how to say that in a way that still conveys it, but isn't too like, ooh, this is...
Yeah, like don't be weird is kind of the short tip. Don't be weird. Anybody else? Observations over here in the back.
I was observing my son. My wife and I were the observers, and my son was the witness, and Tom was the prospect. So he was a tough guy who likes to meditate a lot. And so, no, I'm just joking. As a matter of fact, he was trying to help my son. Hey, you should ask me this to convince me. So I say this and then stuff like that. So it was a very fun interaction between those two guys. One convincing the other one, and at the end, everything ended up, well.
Good. It sounds like that was a fun exchange. Anybody else before we go to the next scenario? So we're going to have another scenario, so we're going to mix it up. Okay, one more observation over here.
When we were talking, I had trouble trying to ask more than one question. You know how you said you had like 3 different options, and having the prospect choose one. It was very difficult to ask more than one question at a time. I felt like I'm more like I'll say one thing, you say one thing, I say one thing.
So wait, were you the prospect or the witness?
Well, in our group, we kind of did it a couple different ways. I think in the case I was a witness, trying to ask or make a couple statements and let him pick one, but it was hard to give several different choices.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay, well, this gets a lot easier, by the way, with practice. So if you do this on a more consistent basis, it gets a lot easier, I promise. You kind of just gotta go with the flow of the conversation, right? If someone directly asks you, how do you think about, or hey, one of our fellow coworkers told me you keep the Sabbath, like tell me more about why you keep the Sabbath. You don't have to like give 3 options. They just directly asked you a question. So then you can still ask the question. If they ask you more open-ended questions like, how did you spend your weekend? Then you can give them more options. So kind of go with the flow depending on the conversation. Hope that helps. Okay, great. Really great observation. So I want you to switch it up. So whoever was the witness, I don't want you to be the witness this time. We're going to go through a second scenario, which is, I should say what actually happened. So this is a real conversation with the same partner that I told you about at my firm who is going through a really tough divorce. So she was asking me about my weekend, and I mentioned I was in Maryland, and she's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you didn't tell me, like we could have had dinner together, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I'm so sorry. It was a really fast turnaround because I was just there to film a quick segment for a faith-based TV channel. She's like, what? Like, what were you filming about? And I said, I was just sharing a little bit of my personal story on like why I believe in God and how do I think about bringing my authentic self to work. And she was like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Like, why do you believe in God? Because I feel like a lot of the benefits, you could just get them by practicing meditation. And I said, that's a really interesting observation. What benefits do you think meditation gives you? So do you see how I don't just assume that I know exactly what she's thinking. So I wanted to understand more, like, tell me more. Like, what do you think are the benefits of meditation? And so she kind of like talked a lot about it. But it was very much what you were describing. It's more like peace and mindfulness and all these other things. And I actually told her, I actually think the incentives for how you live your life are very different if you are a Christian versus if you are practicing meditation or other things. And so I ended up telling her, as a Christian, I actually think that the mindset that you have in terms of how you interpret what's going on in the world and how you react to them and what your incentives are very different, because if you believe that, according to the Bible, God is love and God is actually having a strategy to fix the problems in the world, it incentivizes you to behave very differently. And that's very different from just practicing mindfulness and having peace. It actually encourages you to be selfless. And that's very different. Like I said, I've never seen anything else in life that is able to change people from the inside out to the point where they're genuinely selfless. And that's kind of like a simple version of the conversation I had. And she was like, oh, that's really interesting. She's like, I hope you don't mind me like asking you these questions because I'm just genuinely curious. I was like, oh, no, not at all. In fact, if you want to talk about this more, just let me know. So anyways, so I'm still praying for this person, and I'm still working with her on a project. But I'm really hoping to have more spiritual conversations with her. So, next scenario is different witness in your group. You're part of a 6-person project team in China. This is a Friday, the team is in a bus together, and the team is going to go to karaoke bar on Friday night with the client, and they're going to work on Saturday. And prospect, so you're one of the team, you're one of the team, and so you're talking to a prospect. Let's pretend they're one of the other team members. You, as a prospect, want to know why the witness won't be at either event, at the karaoke bar, and you're not going to join them on Saturday, and what are you going to be doing instead? What is the witness going to be doing instead on Saturday? Okay? So that's the scenario. Please switch up the roles that you had so that a new person is a new witness and a new prospect. So go ahead.
Why aren't you going to karaoke bar?
Wait. Hold on. Huh? I'm in China. So I said, how come? Well, I have a few other things that I was planning on doing with my time. And I assure that you guys will have plenty of fun with it. I appreciate that information, but you guys will be fine without fun. What about Saturday? Unfortunately, I can't make Saturday. I don't know. I'm not saying.
Surely, a special occasion like this, our way out in China.
I appreciate it. I just had made other plans. There's some other people that I would like to meet while I'm here in China, because I'm not here in China. And so there's other plans I've had to meet folks, and that's going to occupy my time. But I will fully engage with the team on Sunday or the next time it gets together. Because you haven't asked why.
Yeah, you gotta ask why. But you're not supposed to ask why. She can ask.
She can ask, I can't.
Yeah, you said you.
Right, I'm being secretary.
But you're supposed,
I'm being non-denominational.
I thought you're supposed to put
Well, I thought I gave enough. Did she have an answer?
I'm sure that you didn't. I don't think you did.
I'm sorry.
Well, it wasn't spiritual at all.
I don't drink. But thank you for asking me closing the question. Huh? They could. But I really don't drink.
That's what I was going to say.
You're an invisible observer.
I figured that.
Kyle has all the experience. He's a ringer. He actually got asked that. Why are you vegetarian? The answer, well, I was raised that way. And yes, it has to do with a little bit of my religious faith. I try to take care of my body. It's too No, you're invisible. No horses. No what?
No horses.
Horses?
You wouldn't have fun.
No.
I mean, I believe, I know, like, in the aspect of health, but I also believe that God created us to be stewards of the animals, and I believe the animals are
1 minute remaining.
Have you seen any documentaries on how things isn't? I mean, beyond the whole ethical treatment. Yeah, you have an answer.
No, I was going to say the hangover was that,
Will answer the question you haven't asked. So those that I'm interested in meeting actually have some similar beliefs that I do. So I'm actually planning on coming together with them at a church to worship. Obviously, and no, we're not. Some of the evidence can be killed.
So I had someone ask me yesterday, because I know.
All righty, let's come back and debrief. So, new reflections, reactions, observations from this scenario. Anybody want to share? Over here.
One, this is a tougher scenario, right? Because you're number one. I mean, the karaoke you can sort of explain away, but the fact that you're not going to pull your weight tomorrow on the project, that's a whole different thing. And I think they did a nice job of Robin did a really good job of talking about the fact that God brings a peace to her, and the Sabbath brings a peace that she couldn't really get anywhere else.
Yeah, I love it. What else? Any observations?
Well, I think everyone in the room knows Mr. Wooten's a ringer when it comes to this kind of thing. He was the witness. Basically, he started off talking about how he's been reading in Genesis and how God gave him the Sabbath, and he moved on to Daniel. And for him, the bottom line was he was going to honor God and what God said, and not what man was expecting or what man wanted.
Okay, that is interesting. So again, read your audience. So I don't know kind of who's the prospect? Okay, you were the prospect. So thinking from a secular person's perspective, what was your reaction to that?
Well, Lyle had an answer to all my questions. I asked him things like, are all Christians so closed-minded, and do you have any hangover cures? And he knew all the answers, so I was pretty impressed.
Okay. Oh, that's so funny. I love it. Again, you had the conversation going. You have to go with the vibe and what you notice. I will say that for me, I rarely try to point to the Bible as the reason for why I do things, because there's no reason for my friends or my coworkers to believe the Bible is legitimate, right? So there's nothing wrong with saying you're a Christian, that you believe in the Bible, but I don't usually say, in Genesis it says this or whatever, just because even though it's so true, unless the person you're talking to, you know for a fact that they believe what the Bible is true, if you use that as your basis for why to believe it, they're not going to follow you because they don't believe the Bible is true. So just know your audience. If your audience does believe, maybe they are a Christian, then fantastic, go ahead and use Scripture. If they don't believe in the Bible, they're atheist, then telling them it's what it says in the Bible, it's not going to often be as a compelling argument. So just keep that in mind. What else? Other observations. What was tough? What was easier? What went well? What didn't go well? Sure.
I agree with everything you said, know your audience, and if you're speaking with a secular person. But I'm curious, how would you answer that? question, how would you work with somebody who was the prospect as the witness? Because I found myself, I was the witness, and I was just like, it was like deer in the headlight, and I reverted back to, she asked me, I can't remember exactly what she asked, but I said, she said, I said that I was going to be keeping the Sabbath, and she said, what's the Sabbath? And she said, where do you get that? And I said, Genesis 2 in the Bible. And I didn't know it. So I felt like that was probably the wrong answer, but I didn't. That's
no
what
worries.
I answered.
Yeah, totally. I'm so appreciative that you asked that question, because at the end of the day, we might say the wrong things. I have lost count of the number of times where I don't actually think I said it the best way, or I didn't explain things the best way. But here's the thing, is that we have the Holy Spirit who is also part of our conversations. Every single time that I have this chance to have a conversation with somebody, I immediately pray and I say, Lord, help me, because I don't know what this person's thinking. So help me know what to say. And even if I say the wrong thing, please interpret what I'm saying so that they will hear what they need to hear. So I fully appreciate that this is not always easy. It gets easier with practice, because you just get the same reps. You answer these types of questions over and over. So we have to just try to do our best, but know that if it doesn't quite go well, it's okay. We can pray and we can ask God to continue working on that person regardless.
And that scenario that we're talking about of how do you do this without the Bible?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'll actually tell you what happened.
It underscores the importance of, I believe it was your message in the sermon where we're implored to do everything to the nines, basically.
Yeah.
We're implored to be not just ordinary, but extraordinary. And Daniel's secret was that he and his friends were extraordinary. And it's very hard to argue. It's easy to trust people who exude greatness. Mm-hmm. That's a great way to lead, is to demonstrate greatness. And so the question kind of presumes, the scenario kind of presumes that you're a valued member of the team and that your opinion matters.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. It's so true, because I'll actually tell you in a minute. I think there's our observation in the back here, but I'm going to tell you what actually happened in the conversation. But what you're saying is, I love this example of Daniel, because his own enemies tried to find something bad to say about him, and they couldn't find anything because he was living such an exemplary life. So going back to this point around experiencing life transformation and making God look awesome, there's Paul calls it that we're living epistles, known and read of all men. That is why it's so important for us to allow God to work on our hearts, because you are in a position of much more influence and ability to say these things when people really respect where you're coming from.
So not only Daniel's capability, but don't you love the passage? There was an excellent spirit.
Yes.
His attitude.
Yes, love that. So comment in the back.
So that actually makes it harder, and that's the challenging part of this scenario, is that you're not giving your efforts, your excellence to the team. And I was a prospect, and although my witness was very good in sharing, this brings her peace, well, what good does that do to me? We're working harder. So, it was a bit of a challenge to bring it into, something that could be benefit to the whole team by you being absent.
Great observation. Oh, I have one more observation here. Maybe one more observation, and then I'll tell you what actually happened, so we have time for maybe one more scenario.
So this isn't really an observation, but more of a response to what Danny just said. My response to that would have been, my Sabbath, the 24 hours, Friday night to Saturday night, is what energizes me and what fills me. And it helps me to get my game on, so that on Sunday, I will do twice the work that you asked me to do. I can't do it on Saturday, but I'm all yours 200% on Sunday and Monday, all the way to Friday. So that would have been my response to somebody who was telling, well, how come you're not going to do it? because that's my time to rejuvenate and to get my game on. Without that, I'm good for nothing. So you guys can count me out. If I don't get this, I am just like mush, brain mush, like nothing to contribute. But on Sabbath, that's when I get my game on. That's when I get my energy. And that's where I'll get all my best ideas to contribute to this project. So.
Yeah, a great idea. So turn it kind of on its head and talk about how you're going to be able to add more value as a result.
They're all going to be hungover, so you'll surpass them with your efficiency, you know.
Okay. So I love these answers, great observations and reflections. I'll actually tell you what really happened. So I remember I was on this bus with my group. And by the way, I didn't leave it until this day to actually mention this. I had mentioned that I wasn't going to, because I knew this trip was coming up, right? I knew it was going to go over the weekend. So I had told them like months before that, by the way, when we're on this trip, I will not be joining you for the work portions during this period. And they were like, whatever, that's fine. But then I was reminding them that Friday, hey, remember guys, I told you that I wasn't going to be joining you all for the work portions during Saturday. And now that it was the actual day of, they were like, oh, okay, what are you going to do instead? Or like, what's going on? And so I essentially said something along the lines of like, look, so what I do is I'm a Christian, and as a result of that, I actually believe in taking 24 hours every 7 days to carve out time for my faith, my relationships, and helping other people. And that's what really keeps me balanced, to your point. It gives me energy. It makes sure I'm focused on the right things. And here's the cool part is, surprisingly enough, in business school, there was actually a class where the professor said it's very important for you to carve out regular time for reflection, to make sure that as you craft your career and your direction of where you're going with your career path, you're actually heading in the right direction deliberately and not just kind of falling into roles over the years. And I remember when that professor said that, one of my classmates who I had literally had the conversation about the Sabbath previously, he turns around in his seat and he looks at me because he was like, that's what you do every week. And I was like, yes, that's what I do every week. And so remember, God is working along the way, and he's going to help you have the credibility and have the opportunities. But in this particular situation, I actually said that, and they were like, oh, that's super cool. So they weren't really upset about it. But I did say, by the way, I actually think we're in a really good place in our project. So I actually don't think we need to use Saturday to do work on our project. So if anybody is interested, would love to have you join me for the day. So that's why I remember we talked about extending invitations. So that's what I did. And there's not really churches in China. So I basically was planning to go spend time in nature, go see the pandas. So I was like, I'm going to be going, spend time go find a place to walk, go check out the pandas. So if anybody wants to join me, you're more than welcome. So I didn't really expect anybody to take me up on my offer. But the next morning, I get a text message from one of my classmates. And he's like, hey, so everyone kind of stayed up until like 3 a.m. And everyone's still asleep except me. I think he left at like 1 a.m. So he was like, I don't have anything to do. Could I join you for Saturday? And I was like, sure. So I ended up, going on a walk with my classmate and going to see the pandas. And in the course of that conversation, he asked me a bit more about my faith because he knows that's why I wasn't joining them last night. And I asked him about like, hey, what are you interested in terms of questions about religion or whatever? And he was like, well, I'm just genuinely curious about the 5 major world religions. He's Russian, grew up in Thailand, so he got exposed to the Russian Orthodox Church and Buddhism. And he was like, yeah, I'm just generally curious about the different world religions. I actually know a Jewish person, but they don't really keep the Sabbath the way you do. So like, what's going on? And so I ended up having a little bit of a conversation around that. And I remember saying, well, since you're genuinely curious and generally curious about the major world religions, if you're actually interested in learning more about what Christianity believes, I'm happy to talk more about it. Just let me know. And that's what we had in China. That's the conversation we had in China. And then like a couple weeks later, we got back to stateside, and he actually took me up on my offer. So we ended up starting to study the Bible on following that weekend. And he was actually the first person I've ever studied the Bible with when I was in business school. So that's what happened. So, I want to credit the fact that it helped have that conversation, to your point, that I'd been working very hard as a member of the team up to this point. And 2 is I basically told them, I don't think you need to work either. So like, why don't we all just take the day off and, and just like relax. And actually what ended up happening is they didn't do any work that day. So this classmate joined me and everybody else just slept off whatever happened the night before. So it worked out. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. Why don't we do one final scenario? And so this one is, and honestly, this is not even one example that I'm thinking of. This is like many common things that are going on right now. So we're going to mix it up again, so pick a new set of prospect and witness. Prospect is worrying about everything going on in the world, right? We have natural disasters that are unprecedented. We've got wars. We've got the upcoming election and all the things included. And then the witness is known by the prospect to be basically pretty even-keeled, calm, and joyful even during stressful times. So that's kind of the setup. So have someone else be the prospect and the witness, and we'll have another 5 or so minutes.
Oh, you just know this. No, I don't know her. You guys can't worry. You never worry. So do you want to be a witness or prospect? Yeah. You don't know.
What are the things that you're worried about?
We should talk about the U.S. election. We just had our cousin broad daylight. The world's, the country's going down the tubes. We're not supposed to do that. How do you do
What kind of things? Well, is there anything we can do? I mean, I acknowledge it is worrisome, right? Because basically you don't know what is going to happen. And you feel out of control, right? What can you do to influence that? If anything, there's not much, if anything, you can. So I happen to have faith in God, and I believe He is enough for us, and He wants us to trust Him with that. He may or may not, but whether or not He chooses to protect me or not, I'm still going to trust Him. Because of all the alternatives, He's the best choice. And whether He chooses to prevent me from being shot or not, or my catalyst converted me I feel that, first of all, that would would be quite a sight. But I also think that answering violence with more violence tends to multiply the violence. Would you agree? But I'm not saying you need to be passive about it. You can take precautions. For every answer that the world has to offer, it's not getting any better. I think I've found a better answer, and it may not be better in the short term, but the long game, my long horizon buzzword, that's where I put my focus in. Well, I got the war in the media. I'm worried about what happens at the end.
Bring it back. How did this one go? Hopefully it's getting a teeny bit easier with some practice. Any reactions, observations?
Sure. Why was this one difficult?
Well, you want to get into the Bible, really.
Yeah.
And that's how you find my strength.
Yeah.
And where I go for peace,
Yeah.
And so I was trying not to. It was difficult. And then he'd come up with some interesting answers. But it was hard, I think.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you said that, because it can be challenging to figure out, like, how do you put some, like, bait in the water but not go overwhelming. Yeah, and so it's okay to just keep it very simple, right? If you're getting peace from reading your Bible, you can just say that, like, hey, one of the things I do is just read my Bible, and it actually encourages me for, starting my day. But try to add other options that are not necessarily spiritual.
Oh, right. Well, I was trying in, like, nature.
Perfect.
Yeah, animals, your family,
Yeah.
just kind of things that...
Yeah, that's perfect. So saying, like, hey, I like to go on hikes on the weekends, or I like to spend time with my family. Like, it helps put things into perspective. Like, all of those things are perfect.
Well, I feel like you're kind of on the spot a little bit here, too. I mean, when you're in a conversation like that, I would think it would flow easier.
Yes, it's a lot easier when it's like, and you know the person, right? Like, it's a natural conversation. You kind of know where they're coming from. So, yeah, it's a lot easier in real life.
George, I want to know why the prospect is so seasoned in difficult answers.
I have no answer for that.
So I actually had this conversation with the guy who gave me my first administrative job. So I could have this, probably a statue to him in my backyard. He's an amazing guy. Yeah. He's an agnostic/atheist. He was a Catholic, raised as a Catholic. He went to a Jesuit school, and he said they tore my faith out of me and never gave me anything else.
Wow.
So we had this conversation, and we were at the last election cycle. He was saying, I don't know what to think. We've got both of these parties, and neither of them really have any solutions. And I said, well, I don't think they do either. But I think that God has some solutions, and I don't think there's a human solution. And his comment was, and I didn't. Now I'm ashamed I didn't follow up better. He said, I wish I had that faith.
Wow.
So because he didn't have faith anymore. It was sort of educated out of him.
Yeah. Wow. Well, doesn't stop you from following up with him now.
No, tomorrow I'm going to call him. I'm going to call Jim tomorrow and say, hey, let's talk about this conversation. Because it's now election time again, so it's a perfect opportunity.
Timing, yeah. How is he feeling now? Yeah. Sorry, what were you saying?
I was just saying, let's talk about the election.
Maybe like more like, hey, how are you feeling given everything going on? Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, Nora and Amelia. Amelia was the witness, and Nora was the prospect, and they did an amazing job. And it went to the fact that Nora was, well, if God is such a good God, then why does he let all this stuff happen?
Ooh.
And so Amelia was able to share that she reads the Bible and she prays, and that is one thing that gives her the peace that she needs, not to worry about these things. I mean, they did tops.
Wow, amazing. And when you have someone who asks that question, don't be afraid to leave them with the open-ended invitation to say, hey, I found this type of hope and encouragement from reading. If you ever want to see it for yourself, let me know. We can talk about it more. So I love that. Anybody else? Okay, so for the sake of time, because I want to make sure we wrap soon, I'm not going to do the final scenario, but basically, the really quick example here, just to give you another data point, is I was taking a class in business school that I kind of fondly reference as how to avoid committing white-collar crime and going to prison. And because actually there's been a lot of Harvard graduates who unfortunately have gone to prison. And so the professor was essentially telling us that you should stick to your morals to avoid committing white-collar crime, et cetera. And I had a classmate who had taken the class the previous semester, and she was like wondering what I thought about it. So she's like, hey, how's that class going? And I said, oh, it's like super interesting, but I think there's a glaring oversight in this class. And she's like, what is it? And by the way, this classmate that I was talking to is Hindu. So I told her, it assumes that you have morals. So it doesn't really talk about where do you get the morals from. It just tells you to stick to some obscure set of morals. She was like, oh, that's a really good observation. She was like, where do you get your morals from? And so I ended up sharing a little bit more about my story and like how I think about morals and where I think they really come from. And as a result of that conversation, I had a few Bible studies with her, which was very interesting because I don't know how many conversations you've had with Hindu people, but there's actually some interesting parallels between what they believe and what we believe. And after we had a couple of Bible studies, she was like, you know what our conversations are telling me that I actually don't know what I believe. And so she's like, before I ever continue down this journey, I actually think I need to take a more serious look on what I actually believe about God and faith. So that's actually what happened with that scenario. What I want to really quickly cover is a few more tips. We already talked about some tips. I'm going to give you a few more tips. So first is remember what we talked about is that the Holy Spirit actively is partnering with us to have these conversations and to have these opportunities. So when you start your day, actually ask God to proactively send you hungry fish, right? And I want to encourage you because when I first started my new job, it's remote. Not my new job now, it's been 3 years actually. But when I first started the job, I didn't know how I was going to naturally meet people because everyone's in different parts of the country and some outside of the country. And so I was praying like, Lord, how do I have more opportunities to actually have these spiritual conversations with my new coworkers when everybody's remote? It's not like I can get to know them in the office. And after I prayed that, a week later, this is mind-blowing, one of my coworkers messages me and say, hey, I have a new client opportunity. Would you like to join me on this project? And it happened, this has never happened to me in the course of my professional career, happened to be an Adventist organization. And he didn't even know I was an Adventist Christian. So when he told me the name, I was like, what? You know, Andrew, I'm actually an Adventist Christian. He was like, what? And so as a result of that engagement, he asked me a ton of questions about like what the client believes, and like I explained to him why you shouldn't be emailing them on Sabbath. And over the course of time, I've taken over managing that client. And so every time I have people working on projects with me on this client, I have a chance to share a bit more about what Adventists believe and why. So, and that was, again, after I was not sure how to reach my remote colleagues, and I prayed about it, and God sent me an Adventist client, which I thought was a super cool answer to prayer. We already talked about why it's important to ask lots of questions to get context, and how that's going to actually help you set yourself up for success if you do get a chance to study the Bible, because it's going to give you more understanding of how to position questions about the Bible in a way that will speak to their context. Schedule separate dedicated time. So remember, this is like, don't try to answer or give them tons of fundamental beliefs in like a tiny period of time. Just try to whet their appetite and say, hey, if you ever want to know more, just let me know and let's set up more time. This fourth one, redefine success from an interaction. This is important because we're kind of raised to assume that success is having just someone baptized and like going to church every Sabbath, right? But the reality of it is, when you're dealing with this group of people, it generally takes them a lot longer to make a commitment because there's a lot of other things that they're probably not wanting to let go of. So if you think about this on a spectrum where 1 is like diehard atheist, 10 you could say that's like a committed baptized member of the church. I often meet with people that are like in the 1 to 3 range. So they could be very atheist, or they could be like agnostic, very non-religious, or don't really care about faith. And so when we talk about redefining success, it's okay if all you do from your interactions is get them from like a 2 to like a 4, or like a 2 to maybe eventually a 5. That is okay because you're just part of this person's spiritual experience, and you never know how else God is going to continue to work in their lives. So don't feel like I have to get this person from a 2 to a 10, because it takes a while. Like my friend from China that I had the conversation with and we spent the day on Saturday together, I'm still friends with him. He is not a baptized member of the church, but I studied the Bible with him for over a year. And over the course of time, what I noticed with these people is maybe they're not a baptized member. This has been like a few years now, but I noticed lifestyle changes, right? Like I noticed people who stopped binge drinking. Like one of my other friends, the makeup friend, he stopped binge drinking. My friends they start thinking about how to repair their relationships, right? A lot of them have estranged parents. And so they've talked about how they have to forgive their parents. They've talked about how they can be better sons or daughters. They talk about how they can improve their lifestyle. They've made a lot of lifestyle changes. My friend from the China story, he actually started eating much healthier. I think he actually went vegetarian. And he started actually praying on a regular basis. So you don't necessarily see someone in the course of a few Bible studies go from like a 3 to a 10, but you see people slowly moving along that spectrum to like a 5 or a 6. And that's okay because we're called to be God's witnesses. We're not his lawyers or attorneys. So continue to pray for people, continue to maintain that relationship, and just watch the Holy Spirit work. And then lastly, start where they're interested, but ground any topic on God's love. So I always like to ask people, what are your biggest questions about God and faith? And I always write everything down. Honestly, I've gotten everything from like no questions to 3 questions. To one point, I even got, someone sent me a Word document with 35 questions. So you never know what people have on their minds, but whatever it is, make sure you are creating a foundation to explain the answer to their questions in the context of the story of Scripture and in the context of who God is, right? That God is love. And for advice on this, I highly recommend the Arise program from Lightbearers. They have an online training, they have in-person and online as well, and it literally walks you through the story of Scripture in a very narrative format, which is much easier to help understand what God is trying to do on planet Earth. So please do think about that. By the way, there's very few published Bible studies on a lot of the questions that I've gotten over the years. So this will also reinforce your own ability to study the Bible because you'll often have to craft your own Bible studies. Okay, last few things. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but like there are so many Bible verses that talk about how we are not where we are by accident. Right? The job that you have, if you're, whatever position in life you have, if you're a homemaker, if you're a professional, if you're in school, anywhere that you are, that's not by accident. And God is calling each one of us to fulfill a very special purpose in the lives of the people around us. And what I want to end with is 2 thoughts. One is that when you do this, when you actively incorporate proactive sharing of the gospel, it reinforces your own heart conversion. So we talked about that prerequisite of having and experiencing heart conversion in order to share the gospel. Well, the beautiful thing about that is when you are sharing the gospel, it continuously reinforces your heart conversion and grows your faith and helps you to get to know God better. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with one really powerful quote. It requires more grace, more stern discipline of character to work for God in the capacity of mechanic, merchant, lawyer, or farmer, carrying the precepts of Christianity into the ordinary business of life. So it requires more of that stuff than to labor as an acknowledged missionary in the open field. It requires a strong spiritual nerve to bring religion into the workshop and the business office, sanctifying the details of everyday life and ordering every transaction according to the standard of God's word. But this is what the Lord requires. So in other words, for those of us who, we're lay people, right? We didn't go to seminary. We don't necessarily know, we didn't grow up knowing tons and tons about the Bible, but at the end of the day, we are called by God to represent Christ in any position that we happen to be in, right? Even if you're a homemaker, not only do you have a tremendous responsibility to be Christ in your home, to your own family, but let's talk about your neighbors. Let's talk about the parents that you interact with that are the fellow parents of people in your kids' schools, right? So think about how much God expects of each one of us. We talked about this morning about generating a return on the investment that God makes in us. So even though it's actually a higher bar than what it takes to just be a regular missionary. Now, I'm not denigrating what regular missionaries do. They completely do a fantastic job of sharing the gospel in some very tough spaces. But God is expecting all of us to be urban missionaries in our own cities and towns and neighborhoods and communities. So that's my last question for you is, will you take up this challenge, right? Will you embrace the calling that God has given to each one of us? And I'm going to end with one final thought, which is, I actually know from talking to our friend here from the conference that there is a shortage of pastors and I think teachers, right, that you said, which is sad because we need people who are very effective in those roles. I will also say, though, that whenever I have spoken at some of our Adventist institutions, including Andrews, I had a conversation with a student who came up to me after I shared my story, and he was like, I'm so grateful that you shared about how you can witness and how you can share Christ in these secular spaces, because I had a conversation with a professor, and I told him I'm interested in business. And he told me, no, you shouldn't go into business. You should go into the seminary because that's where you can work for God. And I respect that if people have a calling to go into ministry as a pastor, you should 100% do that because there's a shortage. But if you're not experiencing that calling, don't assume that you can't share Christ, you can't work for God in those other spaces as well, because I would argue there's even fewer people going to those spaces and being missionaries. So that is my encouragement to all of you, is to, whatever your calling in life is, ask God to lead and pray for the Holy Spirit to use you. So with that, let's bow our heads for our closing prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving all of us an incredible basket of assets and blessings and talents that we can use to share the gospel and to glorify you and to bless the people around us. And so I pray that every single person here would feel not only called, but also equipped and capable to share Christ wherever they are, whether that's with their coworkers, with their neighbors, with their family members, with their friends and their classmates. Lord, I pray that you would pour out your Holy Spirit on every single person here, and that you would give them the courage to share you with the people around them. In Jesus' name, amen.